How you doing, guys? Today we're going to start putting the 4 horsepower vertical shaft Briggs & Stratton engine for the Rugg carpet cut back together. Guys, today we are going to put the Rugg carpet cut engine back together. Specifically, if you didn't see one of my prior videos, it is a vertical shaft L-head Briggs & Stratton 4 horsepower engine. The essential reassembly of this motor is exactly the same as the engines that I've done in prior videos. Clinton engines, Kohler engines, even though they're horizontal shaft, iron blocks, they're basically all the same. First thing that we're going to do is go ahead and install the valves. That would require a valve spring retainer, and a new valve spring. I specifically have a brand new valve. It's already been lapped, and the lash has already been set. That was in my prior video. Really kind of like the tool that you should really have is a valve spring compressing tool. This happens to be a Briggs & Stratton one. I just got this one, actually. I have another one that I've used for years, but the jaws, if you would call them, are just always, it was just too big. It wasn't a Briggs & Stratton one, and I don't know why I've waited so many years, like 30 plus years, to buy one of these, but I bought one. I bought it off Amazon at like 9 o'clock in the morning, and literally it must have been at the hub because it was at my house by like 3:30 in the afternoon. So can't beat that. Essentially what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to make sure that the valve stem and the seat is super clean. I've already cleaned the valve stem itself, so let me go ahead, get a paper towel and some brake clean. Okay, so I've cleaned the stem. I've put a little bit of bearing grease on the stem, just regular old bearing grease. Now, I guess there's a Briggs & Stratton grease that you can use. I just don't. I've just never used it. I've just used the bearing grease. It's exactly what I've used when it came to Kohler engines as well as Clinton engines. Just grease up the stem, slide the valve in and out of the guide until it's fully, you got a little bit of grease going everywhere. I'll slide the valve up so it's basically in the guide, but the stem is not protruding into the valve spring area. Basically set the valve spring and the retainer in the compressor. Compress the spring a little bit. I'm going to drop it in. The valve end or stem end will come through the bigger end of the keeper. I'll drop it in, and then I'll just loosen this up, and then it should retain into the valve itself. So let's see here. There we go. Drop it down like that. I'm just going to release this a little bit till it grips everything. It appears that it has gripped. And it appears that it's there. Just going to make sure the spring is nice and straight on the stem. All right, I'm just going to grab a screwdriver real quick. And the reasoning for the screwdriver is I just want to test the valve, make sure oh yeah, that actuates nice and smooth. All right, well, that's the intake valve. Next up, exhaust. The valves are installed. I made sure that the retainers were engaged in the valve stem ends completely. There's no issue there. Made sure the valve springs themselves are fairly centered, or the valve is fairly centered in the springs themselves. I took my flashlight, turned the lights off in the shop, just shined it into the port to see if there was any light showing around the seats, the valves and the seats. There's nothing, so they're all good. So this is adding up to that the valves will create some good compression. There is a little bit of grease at the end of the valve stem right there, just as it goes into the guide. Nothing to worry about. That'll just burn off as soon as we start the engine. Next up, let's put the piston rings and rod together. I'm going to go ahead and put the piston assembly together. All the parts are brand new. New rod, piston, pin, clips, and rings. The rings were end gapped in a prior video, so we're just going to need to follow the pattern that they provide us. You know, look at the ends of the rings, whatever the profile is. That's where we kind of set it up in the piston. Obviously, this is the compression. This is the oil control ring. Sorry, that goes on the bottom. So really, it's just these two rings. Which one goes where and what orientation. So nothing too big. I am going to go ahead and put the rod in the vise. I'll just put some pieces of wood on either side of the vise jaws to clamp down on this. I'll loosen up the bolts and then take the cap off. I'm going to go ahead and clean everything with brake cleaner and a paper towel very gently, making sure we get inside all of the little crevices just to get all that old dirtiness that's been in the boxes. So inside of the pin, all the ring lands, the wrist pin area of the piston, the underside of the piston, obviously in the journals, and where is the oil hole on this thing? Oh, there is no, oh, there it is, sorry. The oil hole on our Briggs, I guess, is in the beam, in the side where the bolts are. Actually, that makes sense because this is a vertical engine, so the oil hole would have to go up. All right, so there it is. So let me go ahead and get this all together. I will just use my ring installer tool, you know, expander tool, to get them over so I don't scratch the sides of the piston. That's really the biggest thing. And then we'll go ahead and lube this up. I'm definitely going to put assembly lube all over the pin, all in the inside of the piston itself. I'll oil the rings when I'm ready to put it in the block, as well as I'll lube the end of the rod once we're ready to install it. But let me go ahead and get this together, and we'll move on to the next step. Just a suggestion: when you take these rods apart, get a marker, like a Sharpie marker, and just mark the indicator notches, or sometimes this one has like a little pedestal. These two marks on the cap and the rod have to go back in this position because the cap is actually machined to the rod in this fashion. I also like to make a mark on the bolt that corresponds with that, so that way I know this bolt goes in back directly into the hole that it came from, as well as that bolt. So that way when we put it in the motor, we torque it all down, everything should be situated as it was machined by Briggs or Kohler or Clinton for that matter. Okay, piston assembly is put back together. We have the rings on, we have the pin in, the wrist pin clips in place, the pin, the rod, everything, and the piston's all been assembly lubed. The way the rings worked out on this motor is the top ring had the bevel up, the second ring had the notch down, and then we had the oil control ring. So everything is oriented correctly and assembled. Next up, I have the block. I just inverted it on the top. I blew it all out with air, made sure it's clean. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm assembly lube this aluminum bearing area. I'm also going to put assembly lube all over this end of the crank and slide it in. Once I get that in, then we can get the ring compressor. We can oil up all the rings, get the ring compressor in place, and then we can put the rod and the piston back in the bore. So let me get that cleaned up, make sure this thing's squeaky clean, everything lubed up. We'll get the crank in, and then we'll figure out how we're going to situate this block in such a way that I can get the piston in there. Crankshaft is lubricated, as you can tell. It's dripping, but it moves real nice and smooth, so we're good there. Time to orient the rod in the motor according to the little piece of paper that came with the rod. The assembly marks have to be on the opposing side of the carb, which is interesting, and I'll show you that in a second. And if we flip the piece of paper over, we have the same situation right here. Carb side, assembly marks, so they're on the opposing side. We even have the same conversation here in the book. There's the assembly marks, and we have the carb side. So it's just kind of interesting. Well, what does that mean, really? I mean, because on this engine, even the intake valve is on this side, but the carburetor is on that side. And if I drop the rod in like that, the oil hole on this side of the rod will be facing down. And I don't believe that's correct. I believe the rod has to be in this position when we look at it, where the oil hole at the top and just these 3 notches for the drain. So I went out to the shed and I pulled this engine out, which was a running engine but smoked like a chimney. And when we look down inside, we have the notches or the assembly marks on the gas tank side of the motor and the oil hole facing the flywheel. So then I said, all right, so let's check one other thing. I went to my old Clinton. Now I know this is Clinton, but I went to the Clinton manual and I kind of fisted through this to the vertical shaft section on this manual, which is essentially right here. I believe this is it, right? The valve, where is it? There's the schematic for the valve for the vertical shaft engine. There we go. All right, connecting rod. Where is it? All right, right here. It says oil hole or oil access slot in connecting rod should face flywheel side of engine. So that would bode to the engine that I have here on the floor, which has the oil hole towards the flywheel. And I'm assuming that although the directions for Briggs & Stratton says the carb side, they're actually meaning the intake side or the intake valve side of the engine. So we're going to go ahead, we're going to get the rod situated and installed. One thing I want to just point out that I learned, because I did not know this, I have a Briggs & Stratton ring compressor. It has a series of notches at the top and it's flat on the other side. The notches, because I do a lot of cast iron engines, the notches go against the face of the block when it's a cast iron engine. But because this is aluminum, according to the manual, the notches are going to go up and you're going to use the flat side of the ring compressor. It's my assumption, again, that the reason for that is if we use the notch side and you go to tap the piston in, there's a chance that you could actually make marks in this soft aluminum. But if it's just the flat side, it should just drop right in. All right, that was a lot. But let's go ahead and get this all loaded up and oil dolled up and drop that piston in. Rod's installed. I torqued the bolts to 100 inch-pounds as per the manual. I did step it up. So in other words, I set that to 60, that one to 60, that to 80, that to 80, 100, 100. And then made sure everything turns real nice, which it does. And then bent over the retaining tabs. Next up, I have my intake and my exhaust lifters. I'm going to clean them, assembly lube them, slide them into the bores. I'm going to grab the camshaft, sorry, put all sorts of assembly lube in that area, line up the timing marks, and slide the cam into place. Okay, cam is installed. Timing marks, as you can see, are lined up. Assembly lubed the governor area. We have the little governor spring in place. The governor's been cleaned and pre-oiled. It's lined up with the governor arm itself. We'll have to do a little bit better alignment once I get the cover. I pre-lubed the main gear here. So everything here is lined up and ready to go. I'm going to go ahead and clean the base, clean the surface, get the gasket out. I got to clean the bolts first. That's the other thing. I got to clean these bolts first. And then what we'll do is we'll go ahead and put the base on, we'll torque it into place, and then the short block is pretty much all set. And there it is. The short block is all set and ready to go. Pistons in. I did, as you saw, I put the seal in the bottom of the motor so that way it won't continuously leak oil. But that's all set to go. We have the base plate in place. I torqued everything to 100 inch-pounds. The crankshaft end play is probably a little bit more than spec, but it's going to be good enough. It's fine. Outside of that, there was a little squeeze, as you can see, just a little squeeze of that Durco sealer that I put down from those, because it had just a couple little dings in the aluminum. I'll get that off. You won't even be able to. You won't even see it. The governor arm seems to be in the correct position, and everything just looks right. All right. So the new little motor, or the motor for the Rugg carpet cut, is moving along nicely. All right, guys, thank you very much for watching. If you could please like, share, and subscribe. And, you know, if somebody you know that might be interested in this, let them know that the videos are out there. And until the next project, as always, have a great day.